me in, share with me what's happening. So the individual, the man, tells me that Friday night, the previous Friday night, his wife, after the Friday night meal, wasn't feeling well, and there was some level of discomfort and uncomfort. And slowly, as she was preparing herself for bed, it got increasingly worse. And she went into bed, and her back was bothering her, and her chest was bothering her, and she was just feeling more and more uncomfortable. And as the minutes and as the hour already started to go on, she turned to her husband and said, I really don't feel great. I don't feel so well. So they were back and forth, what the next step should be. And her husband wisely asked her, said, if it wasn't Shabbos, would you go to the hospital? And she says, yeah, 100%. If it wasn't Shabbos, I would absolutely go to the hospital. The husband very quickly assessed the situation, got his wife in the car, and rushed to the hospital. About an hour and a half later, it was clear that she was in the onset of a heart attack. And as a result of the husband's very quick thinking, he saved her life. She had a triple bypass surgery a few days later. And as a result of the husband's very quick thinking and quick on his feet and asking the right questions, he was absolutely able to save his life. The end of the story is that this woman was only 43 years old, and one would not have imagined that she would be in such a predicament. So therefore, the first thing that I want to share, and I feel it's important as a rabbi to share because we don't talk about this as enough, is that anytime there's any doubt, any question, any suffix at all as to whether or not somebody is in a circumstance where they feel any level of danger, what we call pikuach nefesh or a suffix pikuach nefesh, anything that's threatening, life-threatening, potentially life-threatening, no questions asked, you move and you get going right away. And I believe that the husband's question that he asked his wife was the wisest question to ask. And this should really be the barometer for anybody asking themselves whether or not they should be heading to the hospital on Shabbos. Really, the question should be, if it wasn't Shabbos, would you go to the hospital? And that should be the line of demarcation in terms of what one should do in such a circumstance. And that ultimately was able to save his wife's life. Thank God she's doing better. She's recovering. She's still in the hospital. But about a week plus later, that is the end of the story. So even in a circumstance where one would not have thought of a problem, one is healthy. But if there's any suffix, any doubt, any question, any issue at all medically, one should make sure to make that decision and to make a move. Just to stress this point, I want to share another story that unfortunately did not have the same ending. This is a story that I know firsthand. There was a couple who started to notice on Shabbos that their child was acting kind of strange and out of the ordinary. There wasn't anything that looked particularly different. Maybe the child's color was changing a bit, but there was something that was curious and wasn't right. And the parents noticed it. They were discussing, they were talking about it. They recognized, but they weren't really sure what to do. The child was sleepy. The child wasn't feeling well. The child was acting out. It was a very dramatic and sudden change. And they really didn't know what to do. And they were questioning what would be the best approach to do. Maybe we should go to the hospital. Maybe we shouldn't go to the hospital. Maybe we should do something. We shouldn't do something. And they were sort of hemming and hawing and figuring out what the best step would be next. The husband decided that he would walk to ask his rabbi what to do. The walk was about a 22-minute walk, and the husband walked to the rabbi to ask the rabbi what to do. The rabbi quickly said, call Hatzalah. This was not in our community. This is a call that I got after Shabbos. Somebody shared this with me. Quickly call Hatzalah and get your child to the hospital ASAP. Don't even do anything else. Father runs home, calls Hatzalah. Unfortunately, by the time the child was admitted to the hospital, the child wasn't here anymore. Now, I share that story not in a way to be dramatic or to, scare people, but I'm sharing it because I think it's my responsibility to share it and to impress the point upon each of us and all those listening and hopefully others who will listen, is that reacting immediately to such cases is critical. And it's the difference between life and death. I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. Let me share a third story. And this is a story about Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik, when he was a young man, was not feeling well, was ill as a youngster. in Russia, and at his bedside was his illustrious father and his illustrious grandfather. Rabbi Soloveitchik's father was the Rav of Chaslavich in White Russia. His name was Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, and Rabbi Soloveitchik's grandfather was Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik. And they were doting over young Rabbi Soloveitchik, who wasn't feeling well. They called a doctor, and the doctor came to administer some sort of medication or to assess the situation. During the assessment, the Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, that's Rabbi Soloveitchik's grandfather, turned to the doctor and said, "Would light be helpful to you to assess my grandson?" There wasn't electricity, it wasn't simple. They would have to turn on some kerosene, a flame, or some sort of fire. And the doctor responded and said, "It would be helpful." Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik turned to his son, Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, who was Rabbi Soloveitchik's father, and told him to turn on the light. Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, Rabbi Soloveitchik's father, also sort of hemmed and hawed and wasn't sure if he should do so. And as soon as his father of Chaim Soloveitchik saw that, he responded, and there are two versions to the story, and I'll tell you both. Either he called his son a heretic or called him an Am Haaretz. A heretic is somebody who is not following Jewish law, and an Am Haaretz is somebody who is an ignorant and ignoramus and a boor. And immediately upon Rav Chaim Soloveitchik exclaiming and scolding his son, Rabbi Soloveitchik's father, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, he turned to his father and asked his father, "How come you're being so lenient?" The doctor didn't say he needs light. The doctor said it would be helpful. And clearly everything is going accordingly. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik made the following statement, and this should be our light. Anytime these types of questions come up, he said, "I'm not being lenient in the rules of Shabbos. I'm being stringent in the rule of v'chai bahem, in the rule of pikuach nefesh." Again, I'm not being lenient in the rules of Shabbos, but I'm being stringent in the rules of preserving life. And therefore, we need to know that there is a very fine balance between the laws of Shabbos and the laws of preserving life. And this is something that is not well enough understood. And therefore, we'll talk about it this morning, when to apply what rules. But the first and foremost point that needs to be addressed, that needs to be understood, is that anytime there's a question of life and death, anytime there's a question of what's called safek pikuach nefesh, possible saving of one's life, one must act immediately, not to delay, not to wait, not to ask a rabbi, but immediately to ask. And I want to show you this case in point just so it's understood clearly. In the codes of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, and Siman Shin Chav Ches, chapter 328 in the laws of Shabbos is the siman, is the section of halachas of Shabbos that deal with refuah, that deal with health, and that deal with medical issues. It's arguably the longest siman in all of Hilchos Shabbos. So a person can study all the rules of Shabbos, all of the 39 prohibited labors of Shabbos, all the positive mitzvos aseh of Shabbos, and miss the element or the segment of Hilchos Shabbos, which is actually the longest section, 49 seifim, which is quite significant in terms of the laws of Shabbos. And the Shulchan Aruch writes as follows, and I quote verbatim: "Mi sheyesh lo choli shel sakana," anybody who has a sickness that has potential life-threatening issue related to it, mitzvah lechalel es Shabbos. It's a mitzvah. It's a commandment. It's positive. It's the right thing to do. It's a mitzvah to be mechal Shabbos, to profane and to desecrate Shabbos. V'hazariz, somebody who acts with alacrity, somebody who acts quickly, somebody who calls and picks up the phone right away, somebody who gets in the car right away, harez and meshubach, that individual is praiseworthy. V'hashoel, somebody who tarries, somebody who delays and goes to ask the rabbi the question, what should I do? Harez shofech damim, that person is a murderer. It's very, very strong language of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is quoting the Rambam Maimonides, who makes the statement, and therefore it's integrally important and critical to be aware and be prepared in such situations, not to wait, not to tarry, not to delay, not to ask a question, not to go to your neighbor, not to start considering or contemplating or wondering what to do, but to do what the gentleman did that I told you, and say to his wife, or to acknowledge the situation, if it wasn't Shabbos, what would I do? And I'll also mention, even in circumstances where it's not Shabbos, in any circumstance where there's any question about whether or not one should be hospitalized, one should call an ambulance, make sure to do so. Allow me to share with you the words of the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah, commenting on this statement of the Shulchan Aruch, writes that there's a mitzvah v'chai bahem. There's a mitzvah that we should be alive, that we should live. As Jewish people, we value life, every minute, every breath of life. And of course, that's a different conversation when it comes to the end-of-life care and end-of-life decision-making. But because v'chai bahem, because the Jew and the Jewish community values life to such an extent, therefore it's critical and important that we're even going to be mechal Shabbos, we're even going to profane and desecrate the Shabbos. The Mishnah Berurah continues and says the following thing. Somebody who tarries, somebody who delays, also ha'ish, that individual, shehu mischased, who thinks he or she is being pious, v'yarei lechalel Shabbos b'chol hazeh, and is fearful and frightened, and is not prepared to desecrate Shabbos, ki'im alidei mora, unless he asks a rabbinic authority, unless he asks a halachic authority, harei shofech damim, that's a form of murder. Sheba'od shu ha'olech lishol, in the interim, while he's going to ask the question, Yachlo Shachola Yosef Yuchalistakin, the individual who is sick is going to get even more sick and could find oneself in an even more dangerous predicament. The verse teaches us, Lo samod al dam re'echa, you shouldn't stand idly by if somebody's life is in peril. Ubi Yerushalmi, the Mishnah Berurah quotes the Talmud Yerushalmi, Hanishal Harei Zemguna, somebody who asks the question, should this person be admitted or not? Such a person is not doing what is appropriate. Because what should have happened? The Talmid Chacham b'mekomo haylo lidrosh b'pir kalakol. It's the rabbinic responsibility, and it's the community's responsibility, and it's the rabbinic community's responsibility to make sure that everybody knows this. From time to time in shul, I always make sure to remind people of this. And in this context, I would be remiss if I didn't start this year stressing this point, because it's the rabbinic community's responsibility to make sure that every communal member is aware of this. And if the rabbis aren't talking about it, it's the rabbi's fault. And we are the murderers. And therefore, every community member must know, and it needs to be writ large, it needs to be clear, it needs to be exclaimed, that anytime there's any question of admitting one to the hospital on Shabbos, calling an ambulance, getting in the car, anytime there's a question of pikuach nefesh or safek pikuach nefesh, one is not being lenient in the rules of Shabbos, rather one is being stringent and is following the halacha to fulfill the biblical commandment of v'chai behem. The Mishnah Berurah continues and quotes a tshuva of the Rav David Zimri, a well-known Egyptian rabbi, and his position was that even if the chola, even if the sick person demurs and says, I'm not interested in going to the hospital, I don't want to go to the hospital, it's the responsibility of the caregiver, of the family member, of every individual in proximity to that person to tell him, it's not up to you, you're going to the hospital. And therefore, in that situation, it's critically important that even if the individual who is the sick person is saying, I'm not interested, I don't want to go, it doesn't make a difference. We don't listen to you, and you are going to the hospital. Let me just talk about what cases we're dealing with when we talk about a chola sheyesh bo sakana, an individual who's gravely ill. I'm just going to give a list of some basic individuals. It's not an exhaustive list, but at least that you understand what we're dealing with. A heart attack, like the case that we just dealt with. A diabetic, somebody who has high blood pressure or showing signs of high blood pressure. Hepatitis, shortness of the breath, wheezing, a stroke candidate, appendicitis, or different forms of mental health, including any suicidal ideation. Now, we could talk about mental health separately, but it is important, and this would be the right time to mention, that ordinarily, as we're discussing in this context, physical health and one's biological makeup, when it comes to mental health also has the same rules as it comes to physical health. As we're familiar with, anytime we say in davening or in tfilos and mishaberach, there's refuas hanefesh and refuas haguf. There's physical health and there's mental health. And one's emotional well-being, emotional equilibrium is equivalent in this context. So any type of situation where one sees a form of depression that looks concerning, if there's some sort of suicidal ideation, if there's somebody who's experiencing something that shows a significant form of imbalance, there is no difference at all in that context, and therefore we must act, and we must act accordingly, we must act quick, and we must act with alacrity. How do we deal with assessing such a situation when such a situation occurs? ordinarily, the first thing that one does is typically call an ambulance. So if you're going to call an ambulance and you ordinarily call an ambulance, and that's the quickest way to react, that's what should be done. In many cities, as you're familiar, Hatzalah has the fastest response to any call, and therefore in bigger cities or larger cities where there's a Hatzalah organization, that's typically what one does. In our city, in our communities, one needs to know if that's the quickest response and that's the best way to get somebody who's gravely ill or not gravely ill or potentially gravely ill to the hospital. And if not, and if you're concerned that that's going to take too much time, you get in the car and you drive right away. And one may absolutely drive oneself if need be. You don't have to rely upon the non-Jew, the Gentile driver. If there's any question of pikuach nefesh in any of the situations that I've described thus far, you get in the car and you go. If there's a question, which hospital should I go to? Should I go to the local, closer hospital, or there's a superior hospital that's a bit farther away? We don't distinguish in halacha, and you go to the better hospital. There's always a question to go to the closer emergency room, the farther emergency room, which might be superior, and that's always a question, and that's something that we need to think about and be prepared about if such a situation does come up. Which hospital will we go to? Often when it comes to an ambulance won't give you that decision, and they're going to take you to the closest hospital. But if I'm getting in the car and it's my decision to go to the superior hospital or emergency room that's farther away, it's absolutely permitted to do so on Shabbos if that's where you want to go. Don't wait for Hatzalah. Don't wait for an ambulance. Don't call an Uber if that's going to delay things. Immediately react and do what needs to be done ASAP. As I pointed out, not only is this true when it's clear that there's a danger that it's occurred. Not only is this true when it's obvious that somebody has fainted, somebody's hyperventilating, somebody's lost their breath, somebody has dizzy. Immediately, even if there's a suffix of kana, like the case that I began with, the woman said, I'm not feeling well. My chest hurts. My back has some level of pain. I'm a bit dizzy. I'm not feeling right. In any of those situations, if it's a vadai, if it's certain, or if it's a suffix, or if it's not certain, in any of those circumstances, you get on the horn, you do what you need to do, and you react. These are all cases what we call chola sheyesh bo sakana. So for following the circumstances that we're describing, now the chola, now the sick individual has reached the hospital, has gotten to the hospital on Shabbos. I now like to talk about how we deal with the chola in the hospital. I also will discuss the caretaker, the family member, and visitors as well. But let's begin by talking about the chola who gets to the hospital. The chola has been admitted to the hospital, the sick person has been brought to the hospital, and now the question becomes, what can I do, what can't I do? What can the visitor do, what the visitor not do? What can the caretaker do, what can the caretaker not do? Before discussing exactly what can and can't be done, it's critical to be familiar in halacha that there are two types of sick individuals. We call one a chola sheyesh bo sakana, and a second, a chola she'ein bo sakana. These are the two types of cholim. These are the two types of sick people who are found in a hospital on Shabbos. There are other categories of sick people. We're not going to address them today because they're not pertinent to our discussion. But in a hospital, one will find one category called a chola sheyesh bo sakana, which is a life-threatening ailment or illness, and a chola she'ein bo sakana, an individual who's sick, whose life is not in peril, and who is not in the hospital for a life-threatening reason. The two ways that Chazal, the rabbis, define a chola she'ein bo sakana is one, an individual who is bedridden. Somebody who's in bed, somebody who can't get out of bed, and this is even somebody who's at home, by the way, somebody who might be carrying a high fever, somebody who might have a limb that is not acting the way it's supposed to, a leg that's up, that forces an individual to be at home, that's called a chola she'ein bo sakana. Or, the Chazal tell us and our halachic authorities teach, is what's called a choli kol gufo, somebody whose body is not acting appropriately. My whole body doesn't feel right. I'm just not feeling the way I'm supposed to. I can't go to shul because it doesn't feel right. Something doesn't feel good. So either I'm bedridden, I'm a chola kol gufo. That's one definition of a chola she'ein bo sakana, somebody who's bedridden, somebody who's unable to get out of bed. Or the second in this context is a chola kol haguf, somebody whose entire body isn't acting accordingly, isn't feeling right. Now, although in these two circumstances, they're not life-threatening illnesses, But nonetheless, this is still a significant category in halacha. And I want to talk now about the difference between a chola sheyesh bo sakana, an individual whose life is in peril, and a chola she'ein bo sakana, one whose life is not in peril. When it comes to a chola sheyesh bo sakana, the rule is, the halacha is, Jewish law teaches us that anything can be done for that person, like we've described thus far. A Jew can desecrate Shabbos for a biblical prohibition. You could drive in your car, you're burning fuel. Burning fuel is a biblical violation of the malacha of mavir, and therefore even a Jew is permitted to do that for a chola sheyesh bo sakana, the types of cases that we spoke about till now, whether it's a heart attack, whether it's somebody who's having trouble breathing, appendicitis, suicidal ideations. In any of those cases, for a chola sheyesh bo sakana, one is permitted to do anything and everything. However, for a chola she'ein bo sakana, and this could be a person who's been admitted to the hospital or not yet admitted to the hospital. This could be for a person who is at home in his bed over the course of Shabbos. There are two approaches to take with one whose life is not threatening, but who's a chola she'ein bo sakana, bedridden, or his entire body isn't feeling good. Number one may ask a Gentile, a non-Jew, to do any form of malacha, to do any form of a violation of Shabbos. And that's true both for a rabbinic violation or for a biblical violation. That's first go-to. And a chola she'ein bo sakana, somebody who's bedridden, somebody who's chola kol haguf, their entire body is not well. The first point and the first step that one should do is to ask a non-Jew to do any form of malacha necessary for the chola she'ein bo sakana. If that's not feasible, if that's not possible, and you don't have that caregiver with you, you don't have a neighbor, a friend, or a non-Jew who could take care of that need for you, a Jew is permitted to do a melacha d'Rabbanan, a rabbinic transgression with a shinui, with some sort of change. For example, if something is necessary to be done, and we'll talk about some of these examples momentarily, a Jew can do it with a shinui. A shinui means doing something in an unordinary way, carrying with the opposite hand, turning on a light in an awkward fashion. Anytime there is something necessary to be done for a non-life-threatening illness, it doesn't mean that you have a cold or a cough or you have a kvetch or you're just really not feeling great. What we're talking about is somebody who's bedridden or somebody who's a chola kol haguf, their entire body doesn't feel right. Either a non-Jew can do any form of milacha, any type of necessary help for you, either biblical or rabbinic. And if that's not feasible, if that's not possible, a Jew, a family member, a friend, whoever it is permitted to do milacha for you, is permitted to violate or transgress the halachas of Shabbos on a dirabanan level with a shinui, with a doing something in an awkward fashion, not, however, on a dioraisa level. One very practical difference between a chola sheyesh bo sakana and a chola she'ein bo sakana would actually be driving to the hospital on Shabbos. If you're a chola sheyesh bo sakana, as we've indicated, you get in the hot car and you go any way possible. However, if it's a non-life-threatening illness, then one will only be permitted to go to the hospital through a non-Jewish agency. And that would mean an ambulance, that would mean an Uber, or any of those circumstances. For example, even a woman who is in birth pain, a woman who is a yoledes, a woman who seems to have reached a point or a stage where she feels prepared, ready to go to the hospital, whatever point that her doctor has suggested that she goes to the hospital. In that circumstance, the woman, the husband, the family should be prepared in advance what to do in those circumstances. I always suggest and regularly recommend that Uber is the best way to do that because you don't have to be carrying money. All you have to do is use your app, and you could use it in a shinui, putting and punching in the numbers that need to be punched appropriately, carefully. And if it's done in a shinui, and that's a dirabanan, using your phone, is only going to be a rabbinic injunction of Shabbos. So if you do that with a shinui in an awkward fashion on Shabbos, you have done what is appropriate. So therefore, that's a very significant difference between a chola sheyesh bo sakana and a chola she'ein bo sakana. A chola sheyesh bo sakana you immediately go to the hospital, you get in the car, you drive, you even violate a biblical transgression, as opposed to a chola she'ein bo sakana, a non-life-threatening illness. You're not going to be able to violate a biblical transgression, but you will be able to ask a non-Jew. You call, you make a phone call, or you ask a Jew to do it in a shinui fashion. There's no real shinui, there's no awkward way to drive a car, and driving a car is a biblical violation on Shabbos. So therefore, the best way to handle that is being prepared before Shabbos if you know that you're going to need to be admitted on Shabbos, or if it's a sudden situation where one feels that hospitalization would be appropriate, but it's not an emergency and it's not a rush, one should do so through a non-Jew. But now that we've entered the hospital and we're in the hospital, either if you're a chola sheyesh bo sakana or a chola she'ein bo sakana, life-threatening or non-life-threatening, I'd like to go through one's entry and stay in the hospital. And this will be true both for the patient, as well as for the caregiver, as well as for the visitor. As we're familiar, and those of you, and we'll get to this momentarily, who have been in a hospital Shabbos, either as a patient or visiting, we're all familiar that the upgraded technology and the electronics in our hospitals that are being used are enormous. You almost can't do anything without being involved on some level with necessitating use of electricity. And I'll go through a number of different practical applications whereby you'll see exactly what I'm referring to. And as you know, you are familiar with these as well. The first thing that one has to know is immediately upon entering a hospital, there are security cameras. Everything, every move and every step you're taking, you are being videoed. The cameras are catching every step you take, every move you make, every door you open, and every exit you go in and out of. Halachically speaking, there is no concern regarding security cameras. Most of them are running 24/7, and therefore you are not directly triggering the camera to go on. I'll talk about cases when that's not the case. But in most security camera systems that hospitals are using, and this is the truth in most security systems that are being used today, but a closed circuit security camera system is running 24/7, depending on the type of system that exists. Either it will erase itself every 7 days, every 14 days, or every 30 days. And therefore, the security cameras that are running have nothing to do with anything that you're doing. When you're walking, when you're talking, when you're breathing, when you're opening, when you're closing doors, whatever you're doing, it's not impacting the system from going into play or out of play. It's happening automatically. And therefore, you have nothing to be concerned about regarding security cameras. And as I said, that's true both for the patient as well as for the visitor, and as well as the caregiver, the family members that are there. However, when it comes to security cameras or motion activated lights that obviously are working based upon motion, and many of us bump into this on our walk home from shul, that you have lights that are going on and off. Either you're walking in a particular place. I have this when I walk home from shul a certain way. I know that in front of a neighbor's yard, a light will turn on. So in that circumstance, I'm careful not to walk that way on Shabbos, or I walk farther away from that motion activated light. But in the hospital, you can't always do that. And therefore, in that circumstance, the best thing to do, if it's feasible and if it's possible, is to wait for a non-Jew to walk in front of you. And this is true both for motion activated lights as well as many door openings to get into the hospital. They're going to work based upon waiting for somebody to open the door. So anytime I'm visiting somebody on Shabbos in the hospital, or anytime I'm helping somebody visit somebody else in the hospital, I tell them, wait for a non-Jew to enter. Now, more often than not, the emergency room or the main entrance to a hospital is regularly being opened and closed. It's busy. That's what hospitals are. And therefore, you're not going to have to wait too long. I can tell you the hospital that's closest to us, Holy Cross Hospital around the corner, about a 15 or 10-minute walk from our house, I've never had to wait more than probably 60 seconds for somebody to walk in. And therefore, if I'm a visitor and it's not a rush, and we'll talk about if it is a rush momentarily, but if it's not a rush, then wait. There's no reason that you shouldn't have to wait and don't have to wait. Again, unless it's an emergency and you're getting out of your car and you need to rush yourself into the emergency room. You don't think, you don't stop, you don't wait to say go, but you just enter if it's a life-threatening circumstance, or if you're in a position where you're helping somebody with a life-threatening circumstance. But if you're a visitor and you're waiting, either when it comes to a motion activated light, a motion activated door, wait for a non-Jew to enter first, to go in first. and then you will follow suit. The same thing is true when it comes to specifically the patient. And this is something that comes up all the time. Patients, as we know, are connected to monitors. They're connected to IV. We'll talk about both of those independently. If a patient is connected to a monitor and your movement is going to create numbers to change, which is what monitors do, because when you're connected to a monitor, it's checking either your heart rate, your breathing, and many other things. But if you are connected to any form of a monitor, any patient that's connected to a monitor, if you want to move, you're permitted to move around freely, even though the numbers will change. And the reason for that is as follows. I'm moving not because I want the numbers to change, but I'm moving because I'm a patient and I need to move. I need to get around. I need to be able to go to the bathroom. I need to stand up or to sit up if the patient is in that context and is that situation. If one is connected, a patient is connected to a monitor, yes, you may move around freely, even though the numbers are going to move. We call that a grama in halacha. It's not causative. It's only a delayed reaction. It's also called a psikresha. I'm interested in doing what I need to do, even though something else is going to happen. It's permitted to move around freely in that circumstance. The same thing is true when it comes to the IV. Ideally, if you need to go to the bathroom, so the IV needs to be separated and you can't walk with your IV, if it needs to be unplugged, ask your very nice nurse to be able to unplug it. You should ask the non-Jew to do it. Typically, they don't like the patient unplugging the IV ordinarily by oneself, but there are circumstances where the nurse will permit a patient to unplug the IV. And in that circumstance, if there is no non-Jew, if the nurse is not available and one does have to get to the facilities or to move or to do something quickly, usually I have not found this to be the case because pretty much, thankfully, we have hospitals where the nurses and the care is wonderful, where we are being doted over on some level, at least when we're asking for that to take place. If there is no Gentile, if there is no non-Jew to take care of that, then one may do so again with a shinui. Because we're dealing with a rabbinic prohibition, electricity, for this context, we're going to assume that it's a rabbinic violation. And therefore, if one needs to do so, you could do so with a shinui. Let's continue with other similar situations. How about a bed adjustment? If one needs to adjust their bed, a visitor wants to adjust the bed of a patient, if a family member wants to adjust the bed of the patient, just like we saw with IV, and similar to what we saw with the motion-activated lights, the best thing to do is to ask a non-Jew to adjust it. Now, this typically is something that the patient does or the family member does. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in terms of how we should explain ourselves to the nurse and to the non-Jewish staff in this context. But what I suggest when it comes to bed adjustment is to ask the nurse, is to ask the medical personnel to be able to adjust the bed for you. If that's not feasible, again, if that's not possible, then a Jew may do so again with a shinui, doing so in an awkward fashion, left pinky with your right foot, your left foot, doing something in a very unordinary way with your elbow or whatever it is. That's how you should handle bed adjustments. What about admitting to the hospital and discharge from the hospital in terms of a waiver? What I have found, and it's worked from time to time, maybe it's because I look like a rabbi and I have a beard, but I explain that I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I am unable to sign a waiver on Shabbos. It sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't work. When it comes to a birth in the hospital, certainly when it comes to our hospital, Holy Cross, and in most hospitals, you need to pre-register. And when it comes to pre-registration, I have found that once you're pre-registered, there's almost nothing that you need to do once you get to the hospital. Sometimes you'll have to show your ID or something else like that. But if it's possible not to sign a waiver, that's the best thing to do. If you do need to sign, again, the way to sign would be to do so in an awkward fashion with your left hand. If you're a lefty, then to do so with your right hand, to scribble. They don't really need more than that. Most people's signatures are not usually legible. So simply just to put something from pen to paper, that would be the best thing to do. What's very complicated, confusing, and complex, actually, is the last part of this question, and that is from being admitted to the hospital to being discharged from the hospital. What does one do about discharge from a hospital on Shabbos? So the best thing to do, and of course, if one is able to stay in the hospital, the best thing to do is to stay in the hospital and not to be discharged on Shabbos, either to be discharged Erev Shabbos or to ask to be discharged on Motzei Shabbos. That's the best thing. And the reason for that is twofold. If you're going home on Shabbos, either you're going to be forced to drive, somebody's going to need to drive you, even by ambulance or by Uber. That's Amir La'akum, asking a non-Jew to do that for you on Shabbos. If you're in a situation where you could stay in the hospital, is the right thing to do. And the second problem with it is you're leaving the Tuchum Shabbos. You're leaving the boundaries of what a Jew is supposed to be able to walk on Shabbos, 2,000 amos, roughly a mile and change, going out of the 2,000 square amos. Some of our hospitals are in the Tchum, some of our hospitals are not in the Tchum, and therefore, ideally, one should be able to stay in the hospital. However, there are exceptions to the rule. I'll share one or two. If one is being discharged Saturday morning, and they're prepared to discharge you at 11 o'clock, usually discharge is sometime between, 9:30 and 11:30, and it's a long Shabbos, like the summer Shabbos that we're now. Shabbos is not over till 8 o'clock. And they're discharging you, they need your bed, and basically they're telling you, leave the hospital, and the most that you could do is to stay in the hallway or to go to the main floor into the lounge. If that is extremely uncomfortable, which it might very well be, or if a person is sick and that's not going to help one's recovery, or if one who is in the hospital has children at home, young children at home who need their father or mother, in any of those circumstances where there is discomfort or lack of help in being healed, one is permitted to travel home by the agency of a non-Jew. And the way to do that, of course, is the same way you got to the hospital, but ask a non-Jew or to set it up on your app or to set it up on Uber, that a non-Jew will take you home on Shabbos. If that is the best thing and the best way for you to continue to recover and to continue to get stronger and to continue to get better, then in that circumstance, that's what should be done. What about when it comes to the caregiver, the family member, or others who are in the hospital with you? Now, I recently had a case where a child was in the hospital on Shabbos, and the child was a kid, a 4 or 5-year-old. There's no way for the child to be in the hospital for another 10, 12 hours on Shabbos. It's an impossibility. The child needs to be home. The child needs their comfort of their home space. They need to be in an environment that's safer, that's more feasible for their well-being. Then, of course, the parent, the caregiver, needs to go home with the child. That's uncontested. But if it's a spouse and a spouse needs to accompany somebody else, or it's a family member who needs to accompany the patient, in that context, it's permitted to travel home with the patient as well. But if it's a circumstance where I'm not necessarily needed to accompany the patient and the patient is able to get back by oneself, he or she, but he or she needs to be at home and he or she has permission to be discharged on Shabbos because of the reasons that we mentioned. Mommy needs to be home for the kids. Daddy, maybe yes, maybe no. If daddy does, so then the daddy can go back in the ambulance or in the Uber and travel home in such a circumstance or travel back in such a way. But if it's a case, and I know cases like this, where it's not necessary for the individual who is accompanying the patient to go back, I would argue that in that situation, it's best for the caregiver, the family member, not to go back on Shabbos if it's not necessary. And therefore, it's a game time decision. It's a call that needs to be made. What level of need is it for the family member, for the caregiver to return home on Shabbos or not? And that is what should be done or should not be done. So again, depending on the case, depending on the situation. I often find, especially now, that hospitals are discharging much quicker than they used to, especially when it comes to the maternity ward. They're getting mothers out of the hospital. It used to be 48 hours about 15, 20 years ago. Now it's not uncommon for a mother who just gave birth to be discharged within 24 hours. I've had cases where a mother gave birth late Thursday night, and was home before Shabbos. The hospital couldn't have been happier. The mother could have been happier. I know other cases where the mother's very happy to stay in the hospital for Shabbos. She wants more peace and quiet. She wants to be taken care of more. And I'll tell that mother, that's my wife, who says, I want to stay. I want peace and quiet. I don't want the phone to ring. I love being in the hospital for Shabbos after I give birth, and nobody will bother me. Nobody will will even visit me. Somebody will visit you, but you want to have peace and quiet. In that circumstance, if you're able to stay in the hospital, by all means. The question comes if the hospital is going to tell you, well, we're going to kick you out at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, then you have to make a decision whether or not you should leave before Shabbos, or you're going to have to hang out for a few more hours separately. I have found also, and it's important, we'll discuss this at the end of the presentation, that the hospitals are willing to work with us. And certainly when it comes to the larger Jewish metropolises, New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Los Angeles, where there is a very clear and loud, prominent Orthodox Jewish community, and Audrey can speak to this as well, and Bikur Cholim certainly locally in Greater Washington has a presence, and we've become more known. The hospital is willing to work with the Orthodox Jewish community, and I have found, even personally, familial experiences, and as well as from congregants, who are explaining or try to attempt to explain that I really can't leave on the Sabbath. Can I be discharged in 3 hours or in 6 hours? Could I stay? And I have found them to be accommodating in that circumstance. And again, accommodating in the other cases that I mentioned to you before as well, when it comes to writing or things that need to be done. So everything we've discussed thus far in these contexts is going to be equivalent, both for a chola sheyesh bo sakana and a chola she'ein bo sakana in the hospital. Once a individual who does have a life-threatening circumstance, situation, episode is hospitalized, at that point, when it comes to the family, the caregiver, or the visitor, everything that I've mentioned is pretty much equivalent both for the chola sheyesh bo sakana and the chola she'ein bo sakana. Once we've stabilized the patient, and the patient is in the hospital, so when it comes to security cameras, motion-activated lights, when it comes to monitors, IVs, bed adjustments, waivers, and all of those circumstances that we bump into minute by minute and hour by hour in the hospital, if there's no reason that a delay needs to be immediate, and there's no reason that something has to happen immediately, each of these things should happen through the agency of a non-Jew, or next best scenario, through a Jew with a shinoi. And again, even though when it comes to getting the chola sheyesh bo sakana to the hospital, we do everything that is necessary, once the chola is hospitalized, we need to ask ourselves the question whether or not there's an immediate need or not. As I described in the story earlier, when Rabbi Soloveitchik was a young man, he was in bed, and his father and grandfather were debating how to handle that circumstance. So therefore, they were in a hospital-like circumstance, and it was necessary. Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik felt that his son, Moshe Soloveitchik, should move the candle, should light a candle. However, when we are in the hospital, more often than not, I have found that the patient being cared for at that point is not really doing anything, and it's the caregiver's responsibility, it's the family's responsibility, it's the visitor's responsibility. In that time and in that circumstance, if there is no need for an immediate reaction, then each of these things should happen through the agency of a non-Jew. I'd like to segue and talk a little bit more now about the visitor. And the visitor is a critical component to the well-being, the welfare, and the rehabilitation of a patient on Shabbos. And I found that many times people are now hesitant to visit patients on Shabbos because they're concerned that they're going to violate the rules of Shabbos. And I'd like to speak about that and try to discuss and understand and to appreciate that balance. Yes, it's true that we need to know the laws of Shabbos and be prepared what to do, how to do, and to know what to do in each and every single circumstance. And I know I get multiple questions about that when individuals are visiting patients in our local hospital in town in Silver Spring in the Holy Cross Hospital. Everybody must know visiting patients, especially on Shabbos, is crucial. Shabbos is the quietest day. The phones aren't ringing. And the regular visitors who are driving to visit the patient on Shabbos are unable to do that. And the patient's recovery, I have found, often is very much stimulated by a positive visit, a good word, a comforting visit. That could be in the form of a physical, bringing some food. It could be in the form of emotional well-being, uplifting a patient spiritually. The visitor plays a critical role. As we all know, the halacha speaks of greatly about the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, one of the mitzvahs that are included in a list of things, Ein Lahem Shiur, there's no end to what you can do. It's entry to Chaye Olam Haba, to the world to come. The mitzvah of Bikur Cholim is awesome. Another one of the wonderful things that our organization, Bikur Cholim, does is making sure that patients in the hospital or homebound individuals have people visiting them, because we've seen scientifically, we've seen biologically, we've seen socially that the visitor to the hospital, to the bedridden patient, to the homebound patient goes a very, very long way. So therefore, yes, we need to visit patients on Shabbos, but at the same time, you're correct that we need to make sure that we're caring and making sure to follow the halacha properly. Start with the words of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch actually addresses the halachas of Bikur Cholim on Shabbos, and based upon the Gemara says, Bikoshi Hitiru levaker esachol b'Shabbos. The rabbis only very, very hesitantly permitted one to visit a sick person on Shabbos. I wonder, why were the rabbis so hesitant about that? Why were the rabbis so cautious that one needed a heter, that one needed the leniency of the rabbis to visit a patient on Shabbos? So there are two reasons for that. One, Shabbos is a day of joy, of happiness, of menucha, and we're concerned that visiting a patient and being in the presence of a patient is going to cause tsar, anguish, crying, and very, very non-Shabbostic behavior. So therefore, the rabbis were considerate of that. We didn't want everybody crying and being sad and moaning and groaning on Shabbos, but the rabbi said, we're going to allow you to visit a patient on Shabbos, bikoshi, number one. Number two, we're concerned that a person will begin to pray for a chol on Shabbos, and there are rules when it comes to prayer for a chol on Shabbos, and we'll talk about that momentarily as well, whether it's in shul or whether it's bedside, and therefore the rabbis were hesitant to allow Bikur Cholim on Shabbos, but nonetheless they did. There's a third reason that the rabbis were hesitant. They said, you know what's going to happen? Nobody's going to visit the patient during the week. I'm busy during the week. I'm not going to go visit during the week. I have all Shabbos to visit somebody. And before we knew it, the day of Shabbos would be spent visiting patients on Shabbos, when really that could have happened during the week. Now, we know that that's indeed true, that often we do have more time on Shabbos. And indeed, the Shari Tshuva, one of the outstanding halachic running commentaries on Shulchan Aruch and Siman Reish Pei Zayin, writes the following thing. V'nirali, he says, Shebiyamos hachol tarad b'milei deshmaya o de'amla. If a person is very busy during the week, with whatever responsibilities one has throughout the course of the week, nonetheless, says the Shari Tshuva, u'b'Shabbos sheyesh lo pnai, and Shabbos you have more time, you have more flexibility. Holech lechole ohavo. You should go to visit a sick, beloved individual. Shiodebo sheshlo nachas mizeh. Because I know as a visitor that the patient is going to receive a lot of nachas, a lot of comfort from that visit. Shuba'elov levakro. Mitzvah ka'avid. You're doing a wonderful mitzvah by visiting the patient on Shabbos. You shouldn't hold yourself back. You shouldn't stop yourself from visiting the patient on Shabbos, and make sure you're going to treat the patient properly. Make sure to uplift him, to come with a positive spirit. Anytime this is true, of course, whether it's during the week or on Shabbos, if you're coming with a sad face, a bemoaned face, if you're depressed and you're melancholy, and that's coming across to the patient, that's the worst thing you should do. And actually, you shouldn't visit a patient if that's your demeanor and your behavior. But a visitor should make sure that he's coming with a positive spin, with an upbeat, emotional approach, with a big smile and with a warm heart. And that's what the visitor needs, both during the week as well as on Shabbos. So yes, visiting a patient on Shabbos and Yom Tov is critical, and as I said, might be even more important than during the week, because that is the quietest time. It's the saddest time. It's the time when the visitor says, oh, I wish I was home for Shabbos. I wish I was with my family. I wish I was at the table. I wish I was in shul. And in any of those circumstances, those are critical times to visit a sick patient. However, the Shulchan Aruch makes this point and says, yes, you're allowed to be mevaker, to visit the patient on Shabbos. However, you shouldn't say what you do during the week, refuah shalema, but what do you say, a language that we're familiar with? Shabbos hi milizok urefuah krova lava. That's the language that we use for the Mishaberach in shul on Shabbos, and that's the language I and we should use if you're visiting a patient on Shabbos. You don't say refuah shalema, but you say Shabbos hi milizok urefuah krova lava. Shabbos doesn't allow me to wail and to scream and to raise my voice for your good health and for your recovery, but Shabbos itself should be your recovery, urefua krova lavo, and your good health and your recovery should be soon and quickly on the way. And that's the language we should use. Shabbos imilizok urefua krova lavo. So therefore, if I am a visitor, if I'm coming to visit somebody on Shabbos, I should be familiar with that language. And the same things that we said were true earlier are true as well for the visitor. Again, when it comes to the electric door entering the hospital, make sure you follow a non-Jew into the hospital, or you should go through a manual door. Many hospitals afford both manual door as well as a electric door. If you could go in through the manual door and it's just as easy, certainly you should do so. If that's not feasible, if that's not possible, you'll enter the electric door, but make sure to enter the electric door and to walk behind the non-Jew so that it's not you who is turning it on. When you get to the receptionist desk, it's not uncommon for you to ask the receptionist. There needs to be some level of check-in, some sort of give and take between the receptionist and you'll often have to tell the receptionist your name. The receptionist is going to have to print out a card. It's going to have to be manually posted onto you with some sort of, stick it, or you're going to have to ask the receptionist who you're visiting and what room the patient is in. And when you ask the receptionist that, the receptionist is going to have to go into the computer system and check. Is that okay or is that not okay? Both are okay. I'm simply asking the receptionist what room a patient is in. The receptionist can use the paper manual they have to check what room the patient is in, or the receptionist can use the computer, which might be quicker for the receptionist. But that's the receptionist's decision how they want to check. And that's what's called in halacha daite de nafshe. The non-Jew is doing it the way that they want to do it, what's quickest, fastest, and most secure for them. And therefore, I'm permitted to ask the receptionist what room a patient is in, even though the receptionist is going to use the computer. Similarly, I could put on, or you could ask the non-Jew to put the sticker on you. I often find even during the week when I'm given a sticker, they're not even so meticulous necessary to put the sticker room number with your picture on there. And therefore, depends upon the situation if it should be put on or should not be put on. If I don't need to put it on, I won't put it on. If they ask me to put it on, I will put it on. Certainly, if there are two options to get to the patient's room, either I could take the stairs or an elevator or an escalator, ideally one should take the stairs. Next best is an escalator. Seems to be from research as to how an escalator works. I think and believe, if I'm mistaken, I'm happy to be corrected, but an escalator is not impacted based upon weight, and an escalator is not impacted based upon one person, 10 people, or 20 people being on it. So if me to get to the room requires an escalator or an elevator, it's better to take the escalator than the elevator, because I'm not really doing anything, I'm not adding anything. As opposed to an elevator, and we could give an entire share based upon the mechanics of an elevator absolutely is working based upon weight. Most are working based upon weight, and therefore elevators are more complicated. Better to take the stairs, then the escalator, and then the elevator. In worst case scenario, if you need to take an elevator, again, follow in a non-Jew and allow a non-Jew to go to the floor that the non-Jew is going to. If the non-Jew asks you what floor to go to, you can tell, again, the non-Jew which floor that you need to go to. Again, the same way there's no concern about video cameras for a patient or for a family member, the same thing is true when it comes to a visitor as well. Many hospitals now have toilets with motion sensors. And of course, motion sensor, as we discussed earlier, when it comes to security motion sensors or motion activated lights are problematic. So therefore, of course, for the patient, that's necessarily the only way to use it. If it's necessary to use, in the worst case scenario, again, it should be used with a shinoi. Either you walk in backwards or you walk out backwards. You tiptoe in, you tiptoe out. You do so in an awkward fashion, and that would be the best thing to do. So therefore, yes, a visitor does need to be mindful and cautious of what the halachas are. These are the basic halachas of how a visitor should behave and act in any of these circumstances when going to visit an individual in the hospital, but not to ever forget the importance of visiting a patient in the hospital. I'd like to conclude with 3 final points, and I'm happy to take any and all questions following that. The first thing to know, and I've mentioned non-Jew multiple times, is that we are relying, and if we are relying upon the agency and the help of a non-Jew, is to make sure we're acting appropriately and to explain ourselves. And I can't underestimate this enough. We need to act with midos. We need to act with a kiddush Hashem. We have to say thank you. We have to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Explain ourselves to the non-Jew and appreciate what the non-Jew has to help us. Not to treat a non-Jew as a computer or as a some sort of motor activated machine, but we're dealing with a human being. We're dealing with a tselem elkim. We're dealing with a person. And yes, while in many circumstances the halacha tells us that we should ask for the non-Jew to help us, that we don't do the malacha by ourselves, it's critical to act with midos, to act with a kiddush Hashem, and to use all the appropriate salutations and to treat a person properly. I often find personally, when I explain myself to the non-Jewish medical professional or to the caretaker, they're very caring, they're very respectful, and they appreciate the explanation and they appreciate what they're doing, and they actually find it to be very, very honorable to be able to help to the sick individual or the visitor and the like. And therefore, making sure that when we're dealing with a non-Jewish medical professional, we're dealing with that person, he or she, properly with midos and making a kiddush Hashem. The next point is there are chaplains in a hospital, and we need to understand what a chaplain is and what a chaplain does. What a chaplain does and what a chaplain doesn't do. Chaplain is there to help you with your religious need, but not to be your spiritual guide. That's not what you're asking the chaplain for. The chaplain is there to help you, to make sure that you have the spiritual needs, the religious needs, and the orthodox fulfillment of the halacha that's there for you. Whatever it is, appreciate that the chaplain wants to help you, is looking out for your best interest, is not trying to baptize you or to convert you. That's not what the chaplain is doing. The chaplain is there to be your friend, to be your helper, and to be there to get you through your hospital experience in the best way possible. Finally, I'd like to conclude with the words of Matisyahu Salman. Rabbi Salman was the Mashgiach Zichron Levracha of Beis Medrash Gavo in Lakewood, and he wrote an introduction to a wonderful book called The Halachas of Refuah on Shabbos, which was written by Rabbi Yisrael Bodner. Actually been multiple books of Refuah on Shabbos, and I'm not sure if the Bikur Cholim rooms have them. I think they might, but at least there are 3 wonderful books in English on the topic. One is Rabbi Bodner's that was published probably 25 years ago or so. There's actually one written by a colleague, just was published in the last several weeks. I think it's called Hospitals and Refuah. That was Rabbi Rotberg from Toms River, New Jersey, just published that recently. Israel Bookshop published it. And then Art School has a book called The Guide to Refuah on Shabbos, Rabbi Avram Yagid. I think those are worthy books to have in the Bikur Cholim rooms, 3 different books that are probably helpful to have around. And if anybody wants to research or read or understand a bit more about both the intricacies as well as the balance between halach and refuah, those are great go-to books. But Rabbi Salman, in the conclusion to his introduction, writes as follows, and I quote, "The Ribono Shel Olam will bring us the refuos and yeshuos through Shabbos, with Shabbos, and on Shabbos." And what I believe Rabbi Salman means is that if we keep the halachas properly and fulfilling the letter of the law for each type of cholah, knowing when to be mechal Shabbos, when not to be mechal Shabbos, knowing when to ask a non-Jew, knowing when not to ask a Jew. When we're acting in accordance with the halacha, Shabbos itself will be the refuah for the cholah, and that's exactly what the Hirasa in prayer means when it says Shabbos hu nilizok u refuah krov alavo, that Shabbos itself should be the refuah, should be the agency for patients. And in that context, I'll conclude by offering a tefillah prayer for all of Cholei Yisrael, that all of those who are sick in this country, in every country, wherever they may be, they should all see a refuah, they should reach a refuah. Hashem should help them, their caretakers, their families. Hashem should protect all of those soldiers in Israel who are unfortunately not in great circumstances in hospitals, and Hashem should protect them, to guide them, to give them the strength, the emotional strength, the physical strength. And it's our responsibility, those who are not in the hospital, to thank Hashem for that, and to thank Hashem for our good health, and always to remember and to keep in mind what we say in Shemona Esrei 3 times a day, the blessing and the prayer for Rifa'enu. We have so much we can do for all those who are sick, whether it's visiting somebody who's in the hospital, visiting somebody at home, whether it's praying for somebody if we're sick, whether it's working through Bikur Cholim and seeing what opportunities Bikur Cholim has that we could get involved with. All of those are wonderful ways to be able to be part of our lovely, beautiful community who is so focused on making sure that all of our Cholim are taken care of or looked after. And the importance of such a organization like Bikur Cholim, the Chafetz Chaim writes that one of the first things that a community should do is to make sure that they have such an organization. And we thank Audrey and all of her teammates and her board members, Rabbi Geyer, for everything that they do. I see Rabbi Balto is here and his wonderful work as a chaplain. And God willing, we should see the end of sickness and the beginning of wonderful days for the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu. I thank everybody for being here, for listening. And again, if there are any questions, I'm so happy to take them.
I'm going to take questions in just a second. I see some people have hands raised, which is great. And there also some people put in the chat. There's so much to process from everything that Rabbi Walter said. Thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. In some cases, I learned things I did not know. In other cases, it was an important and necessary review. And I would like to emphasize to everybody that I think it's important that we all review these types of halachot all the time, because we all know we never know when we're in a situation where we may need them. It's always best to ask if we can, but sometimes we can't. In regard to the Sfarim, that the books that of the Jewish laws regarding being in the hospital that Rabbi Walter mentioned before, that it is very important. We do have these books and should be placing more of them, but I will just say on an anecdote that I met somebody recently who stopped me and said, the Beaker Hole in Room in Holy Cross Hospital saved me. There's many ways that could be true. So I didn't know, but they specifically wanted to tell me that they arrived at the hospital right before Shabbat. They were discharged. They were in the emergency room on Friday night. They were discharged and they didn't know what to do. What do I do? There was nobody that they could call to ask that question. It was Friday night, but they found a halacha book in the pantry. They looked at it, they read it, and it gave them the appropriate guidance that they needed to figure out how they should proceed. So those are very, very important to have. I also want to just reiterate what Rabbi Walter said about the chaplains. Beaker Home of Greater Washington works very closely with chaplains of all faiths in the different hospitals in our area. And I think you described it very well. They're an ally, they're a friend, and oftentimes they are the person that can help you with Shabbos issues when you are in the hospital, because they're sensitized to this on their own through their own training, and we work with them as well to sensitize further. They have Shabbat boxes, holiday bags that we provide them with that are delivered to them in advance of those days. And they also understand in many cases what some of your questions might be and how they can help you navigate. Where's the bathroom without the sensor light? Where is the staircase that I can use to get to downstairs, the lobby, etc. That will violate Shabbat. So that's a very important point. Thank you for making it. All right. Now, let's go ahead and turn to some of our questions. Hands are raised. I see that Rabbi Balto, your hand is raised. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, Rabbi, for that terrific talk. I'm a chaplain at George Washington and Washington Hospital Center, and I just wanted to emphasize the chaplaincy point. The chaplains, from a typical non-Jewish chaplain will know their Jewish patients. They'll know a bit about the specific needs of Jewish patients. They'll know Shabbat is special. By the way, there's a Beaker Cholim of Greater Washington manual in all of the chaplaincy hospitals, chaplaincy offices in the hospitals in Washington, D.C. They're there. You may feel intimidated or anxious about asking for certain things. Talking to the chaplain has authority. If the chaplain talks to the nurses and doctors, it will most likely happen. So talk to them about your specific needs. They're an intermediary who can help you. They can also help you on really practical things. We had a family, this isn't that unusual of a circumstance, who wanted to have food prepared overnight on Shabbat. And so we set up a crock pot and in the chaplain's office, and so the family could just go there and get the food they needed. So don't be intimidated by the fact that they're not Jewish. They leave all that behind in the chaplain's office. They're just there to assist you to make your visit as comfortable as possible and enable your religious observance. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Balto.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you. Very, very important points. Appreciate that. I see the shine, since you have a hand raised. Did you want to ask a question out loud?
Surely. If you have a relative, a friend in the hospital, you're a caretaker for them, they're being discharged on Shabbos, early on Shabbos, and will go home by the ways you mentioned. The caretaker is not needed in that circumstance. He doesn't have to return with the patients or their family, but he's there on Shabbos. And for him to remain on Shabbos, he doesn't really, if he's not needed, he can't travel, and he's going to be there all Shabbos without kosher food unless there's a Bikur Cholim, which is not at all hospitals, unfortunately, or other hospitals outside the area. Probably does not have a siddur when he went there in an emergency. What is the situation for such a caretaker on Shabbos who cannot really enjoy a Shabbos like that?
Question. I actually just had this case. I was in camp the last month, and we had an emergency. A child had to go to the hospital, and there were several counselors who went along. So in that case, at least one counselor had to accompany the child home. You couldn't have the child go home by oneself. But there wasn't food in that circumstance, and it was a very long Shabbos. So I told them that they're permitted to return home if they have no food, and the inability to eat over the course of 12 or 14 hours would allow them to go home. If they're comfortable and they could survive and succeed and they'll be able to do so, they're permitted, they're welcome to stay. But if they're starving and they're falling apart, then they're absolutely permitted to go home with the agency of a non-Jew. In the circumstance of davening, that would not be a license to return home. Davening, while being very important, would not allow an individual to go back to use their siddur or to daven with a minyan. I'm specifically now referring to caretakers and caregivers and family members of the patient. I'm not referring to Hatzalah members. Hatzalah members has its own rules that I'm not going to get into in this context. If anybody's a paramedic or an EMT or works for Hatzalah, that could be a separate year. But when it comes to a family member, a caregiver, or a aide that's going along, if the only way for them to be able to succeed by staying in Shabbos is by starving and getting sick as a result, yes, they absolutely may return home on Shabbos.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. There's a related question in the chat where someone said they have to go to the hospital with their wife. It's a Friday night. They ask a neighbor to watch their 3 little children. Then the wife is stabilized. They're able to leave. How do they leave the hospital now? First of all, is that sufficient reason to get home to their children? And how can they do so? I think you've addressed it, but it would be good to hear it again.
Yeah, going home to one's children is necessary. In my house, my wife would be more necessary for the children than me. I don't know how much I could help, but if I need to help her get home, then yes, I will go home. Of course, a spouse, family member should go home as well. Certainly if they're young kids at home and they're being doted on by neighbors or others, it's not the same level of care, and we can't put that on other people. So yes, one would be permitted to go home, depending how many people are necessary to go home, depends upon case and point. And a lot of the things that I'm sharing, of course, are case dependent. What I've shared are really broad strokes and general answers to questions, but every case is different and every situation is different. So if there is a need for a parent or parents to go home and I'm feeling well, I give a case where I've had a false labor, let's say, or a, one of the cases that we talked about where somebody's rushed to the hospital and turns out there was just anxiety. I thought it was a heart attack, and I get to the hospital, I was just, I was really anxious, I had a hard week, and I'm nervous about something the coming week, and my heart is pounding. And I get to the hospital, and I've clarified, the emergency room has clarified that I'm medically absolutely okay. Now, if in that circumstance, I'm able to stay 3-4 more hours on Shabbos, then there is no heter for me to go home. If I'm healthy and I'm able to be comfortable, if there's a porch outside, and if I've eaten, then I should stay the rest of Shabbos. If I'm a parent and I am needed at home and I'm feeling perfectly fine and I certainly could stay on Shabbos, and maybe I'd like to stay on Shabbos, I don't have to put my kids to bed, I have to go home because my children need me in that circumstance.
Thank you. And I think, and in terms of the how, I think you mentioned before, is it
how? Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the hows are very important.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely do so in a way where I, as the Jew, is not doing any malacha. Uber is the best thing. Uber is probably created, I think, deep down they didn't realize for any Chilul Shabbos, it's become the most efficient way for travel on Shabbos because there's really almost nothing that needs to be done. I tell many women who are expecting to keep their Uber on and to have it prepared, and all that needs to be done is with your left pinky to press a call, they'll pick you up and you go. It's also important that if a person is healthy enough that they don't need to do what they need to do by themselves, is to ask the Uber driver kindly and politely, I'm an observant Jew, I'm an Orthodox Jew, could you please open the door and close the door for me? Because when I open and close the door, the lights are going to go on and off. I've had that multiple times. The drivers are very accommodating. They want a good review after their service, and they'll be happy to open and close the door for you. So whatever you can do by politely explaining to the non-Jew that this is what your needs are, and if you'd be so kind to please help me with that, that's the best thing to do. So Uber, everything through the agency of a non-Jew, opening and closing, even carrying something from your front door to the car. If you're not in a Eruv situation, or if you're in the hospital and you're being discharged, those are all the best things to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any questions? If you didn't have a hand raised, if you want to unmute and ask a question, this is a good time to do it. I'm just going to double check in the chat here while we're looking, see if there's any. It does look like there's one more question in the chat, so let's take a look at that. Can a patient who needs to go to the bathroom in the hospital enter the bathroom that has a motion detection lighting system, assuming that there is no nurse to walk in before the patient? Can you go over the set of options? Can a patient call for a nurse using, I assume it's going to be using the call button here, using the call button on Shabbat or Yom Tov?
Yeah, so everything, as we discussed, should really happen through the agency of a non-Jew. That's your default. In a circumstance where that's not possible, then your next level of initiation will be a shinui. For this purpose, it should be mentioned, and I think I briefly mentioned, that electricity is a debate in the later halachic authorities whether the use of electricity is biblically prohibited or rabbinically prohibited. For this context, and according to most great halachic authorities in Chutz La'aretz, in the United States, Chazon Ish held it was the Iraisa, but many poskim in America hold that it's the Rabbanan. For a chola in a hospital, if you use electricity in an awkward fashion through a shinoi, that'll be your next best case. So therefore, if you have the possibility, first and foremost, through the agency of a non-Jew, that's ideal. Next best case scenario will be by doing it yourself or through a Jewish family member in an awkward, unordinary fashion, walking in backwards. You have to know if that's smart for a patient to do. So everybody should be smart. That's the first thing you have to do, is to be smart. And the next thing to do is to do it in an awkward fashion, walking in backwards. Sometimes what you could do is actually stick your hand in and the light will go on, and then you could walk in. But I can't stress enough, as I have before, I have found hospital staff, medical professionals, nurses, and all practitioners to be very kind and sensitive and understanding. Sometimes you'll get a more difficult nurse or a more a busier day where the nurse is, just running around the floor with an enormous amount of needs, and you can't lean on them for that circumstance. So in that situation, if you're either alone and there is not a non-Jewish aide, if there's not a nurse or a medical practitioner who can help you, then do so with a shinui in a strange. That's halacha is there for us to help us when we can't do what we're supposed to do ideally. That's a lot of halacha teaches us how to do things when we can't do what we're supposed to do. On Shabbos, when we're at home or in shul and everything is hunky-dory, so we don't have this circumstance. But halacha always prepares us for situations where we can't do things ideally. And it's important to be familiar with those ex post facto situations and to know and not feel bad. But adarabah, that's what the halacha is teaching us, that's what you're supposed to do in that circumstance. And there are gradations for how to do it. You have to know something is biblical or rabbinic. You have to know if you have to do something with the shinoi or not with the shinoi. But more often than not, anytime somebody is in a hospital, a patient is always at least considered a chol she'ein bo sakana, right? That means you're a bedridden, you're not feeling well. Any patient at least is called a chol she'ein bo sakana. And therefore, in that circumstance, you're permitted to do any rabbinic violation in an awkward, uncomfortable fashion. Much of the things that we're dealing with in the hospital are rabbinic, electricity, and therefore to do it with a shinoi would be the next best thing in a circumstance where there is not a non-Jew to be able to be your agent.
Thank you. Excuse me. There's 3 more questions, and we'll conclude with that. One is a follow-up question. Is there any difference between anything you've just described for Shabbat or Yom Tov? Is Yom Tov different in any way?
Question. Yeah, no, primarily it's identical. Yom Tov Sheni, on the second day of Yom Tov, we often find there are more leniencies, but when it comes to a chola she'ein bo sakana, The rules are identical both for Shabbos and Yom Tov. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you. And then another person asked, if you have a child who seems off, not quite right, you typically, if it wasn't Shabbos, you just call the doctor on call. Let's say it's the nighttime, call the doctor on call and see if this is major or minor. So in this situation, if it's Shabbos or Yom Tov, should I call the doctor or go to urgent care or go to the hospital?
Okay, so I could speak firsthand to that with a few children in the house. You know, many of us are lucky enough to live in close proximity to Jewish doctors and nurses who we could ask. And we've leaned on that in our community multiple times. We weren't sure about a child's health. And you ask the congregant or the Jewish doctor what should be done. That would be the best case scenario if you're sure that you're able to do that. As I described to you earlier in the very sad and tragic case where a father waited too long to react. So a person has to know, every parent hopefully knows and understands well enough as a parent when something is serious, when something is mediocre, and when something is not necessarily serious. I don't think I've had to be honest, in 2 decades, to call a physician on Shabbos to ask the question. It could be it's because we have the benefit of living in a community where there are people to ask. But if you are not sure and you're not certain yourself and there is nobody to ask, then you have to be wise and you ask yourself the question, what would I do during the week? And I think that is a good sort of bumper sticker to keep in mind. What would I do during the week? Now, yes, during the week I would call and I would act quicker. And so I do have to think twice about that on Shabbos if I have to do that. If it's a scrape, if it's a boo-boo, you know, I think we know and understand well enough how to care for that. If it's a fever, I think we understand how to handle a fever. If it's a circumstance in a situation where we're really not sure, I would tend to think at that point it's probably more serious than it is. Also, I think different parents have different levels of concern and different types of nerves. So sometimes, you know, a parent, him or herself, needs to be taken care of when they're taking care of a child because they themselves are so nervous and are so concerned and are so anxious, they themselves can't function. That also has to be taken into account. So every case needs to be focused ba'asher husham. And this is a wonderful opportunity to sort of talk about that and to think about it and to address these questions beforehand. So I would always say that, yes, the best thing to do is to ask a neighbor, a friend who's Jewish, a professional who will be able to address your question. Next best would be if you have your neighbor who you're unable to do that, to ask a neighbor who's non-Jewish to make a phone call for you. And if you feel that there is a heightened level of concern at that point, yes, with a shinui in an awkward fashion, to call the physician, to call the doctor, or to head to the hospital the way that we described.
Can you hear me?
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Somebody trying to ask a question?
I have a question. Yes. What happens when you go to a hospital and you have a Jewish nurse and or Jewish doctor who are there on Shabbos?
Very good question.
And doctor is not from.
Very good question. I didn't talk about this, but in Israel, of course, this is a major area of concern, and it depends upon the case and the situation. Very good question. I haven't really encountered this here, but this is a very important question. You need to know, and you need to explain to the Jewish physician or the Jewish nurse who might not be observant what you can do and what you can't do. So sometimes you as a patient in Israel, no, there's no holds barred. You tell everybody what to do. So you as a patient can tell your doctor and your nurse and your medical professional exactly what you want done and how you want it done, how they should poke you and how they shouldn't poke you, if they should give you medicine, how to give you medicine, because in Israel, the patient reigns and the doctor is just your servant. So in Israel, depending upon your level of knowledge and your level of religious observance, you will handle this case and this situation differently. I will point out, the halacha tells us that anytime there's a question, who should do the transgression, it should be the most religious and orthodox person. That's what the halacha tells us, to teach everybody that this is what can be done and should be done. So any of the cases that I described earlier should be done through a orthodox, religious, God-fearing rabbi should be the first person to do the malacha or to make a phone call, because that's the person who should be teaching and educating those in charge. If there is the agency in Israel of a individual who is not Jewish and that happens quite a bit. There are many of our cousins are in positions of medical practitioners in the hospitals, and they often can do those situations. So therefore, you have to be prepared to do that. We once had a case where we needed a non-Jew to take care of something in our house on Shabbos, a case of Mir Akum. My wife went to ask somebody outside. He says, "You don't want me doing this. I'm Jewish." So, you know, you have to know, and you have to be prepared who you're dealing with and how you're dealing with that person. And you are correct. That's something to be careful and cautious about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So last question I see from the chat is, if you did drive to the hospital on Shabbos, are you allowed to turn off your car?
Very good question. Very, very good question. Yeah. So the answer to that is no. You can't turn off your car. I could tell you, even sometimes you're not going to even think about turning off your car when you're in such a rush. And often the individuals at the front desk are actually prepared to park your car for you. So that's what should be done. You should have somebody park your car for you. They'll take a ticket for you, and you could take it from there. But you shouldn't, certainly if it's an emergency situation, you're going right to the hospital, you're not going to park. You're going right to the front entrance. You're going to leave your car and you're going to rush out, and you tell the person, take care of my car, and they'll take care of your car.
Yes, I think that's very true. Almost all the hospitals have a valet option. Okay.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah. Thank you. Again, Rabbi Walter, this was wonderful. Much appreciated that you took time out of your busy schedule to do this. And for everybody who joins us today, thank you. Thank you for your amazing questions. They were also very helpful and helped move the conversation along. We will send out a recording to everybody who registered after we do some editing. And also, I hope to send follow-up information, maybe with some of the points Rabbi Walter can review, and then we'll send out so that people can have some of this information right in front of them in writing. And thank you, everybody. And I want to wish everyone a good day. And as we approach, as Rabbi Walter mentioned, and as we approach Rosh Chodesh Av, we all can be mindful of all the Cholim in our community, especially here and in Israel, and join with everybody I know in praying for better times and wishing refuah shlema to all those who need it.
Amen.
Thank you so much. Be well,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.